sign of Gemini, the third sign of the zodiac and the first of the air signs we shall encounter, the essential need of the person is to build up a system of knowledge, is to work with their intellect and their powers of discrimination, to find a language and to create a vocabulary through which they can understand the world about them and themselves. This is essentially important. It isn't just about intellectualism. It's the idea that the intellect can be used to create a system of knowledge by which then things around them can be understood. When this happens, there is a feeling that one can articulate what is going on in the world and what is going on inside oneself. Some Geminis are commentaries, commentators of what goes on externally. They're looking outside for this, that, or the other. Very interested in virtually everything, because everything may have a possible link to what's going on. Some Geminis are the other. They're the kind of the reverse twin. They're the inner Gemini that seeks to articulate the language of the inner world. Freud had his moon in Gemini, and wherever we see the moon in the chart, it draws out the emotional contents. So how does the moon and Gemini work together? Well, Freud created a whole establishment of an intellectual system called psychoanalysis, known as the talking cure. So Gemini rules the tongue, the speech, methods of communication. He moves in and out of information, may read or take in knowledge, but really it isn't necessarily book knowledge. That depends on other factors in the actual horoscope. But what he is doing is he is taking in information, assessing it, labeling it, looking for it. And then, as I say, trying to make connections between things in order that their life is somewhat able to adapt to the environment. This is the system of adaptation in the sign, which leads on to its psychology. Why should it be such a case? Well, what's the nature symbolism stemming from this sign? Well, if we think about it, it's the third stage in the season of spring. So it has a vitality, it has an innate curiosity to seek out new things, new people. It has an innate friendliness to it, a kind of curiosity about other people. Although what it doesn't do is it doesn't link too much to the next sign of Cancer, but it knows that that's where it's going. And in many ways, the fear of one sign can be seen actually in the next sign that comes, because that finishes the sign. In Cancer we see emotion, emotional connection, volatility of sensitive empathies and things going on in the emotional world where one belongs to someone else, or a sense of security and belonging. But Gemini can't find that too easily. He knows that the passageway that this section begins is going to leave him behind. So before he moves on into the next season, he must gather to himself all kinds of information and experience with which he can make sense of his own inner and outer world. As an image in nature, or derived from that part of nature, that third section, when I was thinking about this sign for the videos, what came to me was that Aries is the initial spring of life. It's the force, it's the potency in it. Taurus embodies that force, and it becomes something real, alive in nature, something you can touch and see and feel, something you can bump up against. It's tangible reality. That's what the sign of Taurus represents, the embodiment of the spirit. But that creates a subtle duality within a person, that there's a body and a mind, that somehow they are connected, but they have to relate to one another. And this principle of relating to each other and making connections between things underlies the sign of Gemini, and so therefore underlies much of the behavior and the psychology of the individual born underneath this sign. How they think, what they say, how they poise themselves, what their mannerisms are all connected to this busybodiness of making connections. So one of the images that I saw was that butterflies or bees going from plant to plant, making the connections between living forms that were set in stone, let's say, or set in a particular place, which Taurus shows. Taurus is the fixed earth sign of Earth, so once you've planted it, it stays there. But it can still communicate to other members of society, by this kind of this process of interconnected roots, which is Aquarius, which we're going to come into later, but also this process of birds or creatures of the air which connect up to cross-pollinate. They discuss things. It's like moving things from place to place. Typical kind of words that Gemini might make when they're trying to come to a decision. And we'll have a look at this problem of decision making in the next sign of Libra, in which case even more difficult. Is words like when they're asked whether they will go out this evening. What are you doing this evening? Well, I might do this. Or they might say, well, maybe, perhaps, possibly. These kind of interim words which never actually touch base with anything definite. This is the problem within the sign, is that because it represents this airy freedom, this movement, and the ever-present nature of mind and making connections, sometimes it has difficulty actually stating what it wants, because what it wants essentially at its heart is to always connect, to always be making this pattern, trying to find out the names of things and so on, in order to organize experience in a manner for which they can then understand it, all usually as a defense against the next sign of Cancer, against water. They don't understand feeling much. And what's this? What's that? They need a label for it. It's as if somehow all of the air signs have a defensive system against that harsh reality of the material being, the instinctual. It's not that Gemini can't be spontaneous. It can. It can be extremely witty. It can be extremely kind of vital with its words. It's not that all Geminis make great writers. I'm not saying this. Many of them make great actors. I'm thinking actually of Ian McKellen, who's just coming out the film, I think, called Mr. Holmes. They're probably playing the famous detective. But many actors actually are Gemini. It's as if what they do when they first start to enter the world is that they recognize things. And so they can embody or mimic what's going on in the environment. You know, they take a bit of this and they take a bit of that and take a bit of something else. And this generates a difficulty with a center, which is we're going to talk about in terms of the sign of the twins. The center is never there, rather like Libra. It's always somewhere in between. And so this process of generating exchange, communication between things is at the heart of the sign, which is why in medical astrology, Gemini actually rules the trachea and the lungs. It represents the arms and the digits. It's where the body actually starts to divide into two halves. And so it can represent words. It's not the vocal cords itself, but it's the impulse of the mind behind the vocal cords, the breath that comes out. Why it represents breathing, and so therefore, in a way, Gemini needs to have a flow of friends, of involvements. This is something to do with the panicky, fussy, busybodiness, the nail biting of the sign, the anxiety in it, because if it stops still, it feels as if life has stopped still. You see, this activity of mind prevents it seeing the oncoming problem of emotional connection. Now, there may be other facets of the chart which have to do with this, but the principle, as I say, in operation here, is to somehow dissociate with experience, create a mental idea of what they're doing in order to orient themselves and adapt themselves to life. I think perhaps one of the cardinal, shouldn't use that word, one of the most important things in the sign is what it's trying to do to achieve its sense of independence is really articulate to itself what the self is about. After all, the sun is that center. It's the center of our being. It's what makes most sense. All of the planets revolve around the sun. And if it's in the sign of a Gemini, it needs these forms of connections, and as I say, in order to feel whole. But and I think its true essence, what it is doing when it's busybodying and looking, is to bring as much information together so that it can truly articulate what it is about. Only to realize that deep down that what it is about really is creating channels of communication, rather like the passageway from one season to the next that it symbolizes and represents. I'd like to read something out from a 17th century text by a man called William Lilly, who was a noted astrologer of his age. And this is a description of Mercury, or a part of Mercury, when it's what he called ill-dignified, when it goes wrong. And Mercury is the ruler of Gemini, and he is the god of knowledge, thought, or Ani, the god of the scribe. In Roman mythology, he is Mercury, and in Greek mythology, he is Hermes, he who can go everywhere. And just as a tangent, I should say about Hermes, it's very linked to this idea of Gemini and where they reside. They don't actually reside in any one place. Out of all of the gods, it's only Mercury, or Hermes, that actually doesn't have a temple. There isn't anywhere to go to meet him. He's everywhere. Although there is something called a herm. And herm actually means brother, I believe, in either Spanish or Italian. And these herms were kind of pillars of stone. And where they were placed were always at crossroads, where merchants met or people met. And you get this quality of the sign of trying to, forward the progress of individual connection and meeting underneath. But I'd like to read out this text because this is a kind of description of the character, and even then we get an idea of what it of its manifestation through the personality. And remember, this is the negative side. We'll come to the positive side in a minute. Christian astrology. A man of troublesome wit, a kind of frenetic man, his tongue and pen against everyone, in other words, a kind of sarcasm. He's liable to prattling and trying to persuade situations around a certain point of view. He is a great liar, a boaster, a prattler, a busybody. He is sometimes false and a tale carrier. He is prone and given to the wicked art, such as necromancy, which is raising the dead. That's partly one of the trickster elements, that there are certain words of power over people, a power of oratory or a power of an idea, which can somehow make things happen. As such, this is ungodly knowledge. He is easy of belief, an ass or an idiot, constant in no place or opinion, cheating and thieving everywhere. Mercury was the god of thieves in ancient astrology. A newsmonger, pretending all manner of knowledge, but guilty of no true or solid learning. A trifler, a mere frenetic fellow. Usually and easily perverted, constant in nothing but idle words and bragging. We could describe the negative sign of Gemini therefore in these terms, in the sense that they're looking for the trivial, the superficial. Because they're constant caught in the stream of information, they never sit still long enough to understand or to consider really its importance or its value. That's the negative side of the sign. But let's have a look at the positive. When Mercury is well dignified, this is what we come to in the personality, a descriptive of the character. Is a man of subtle and political intelligence. He has cogitation and powers thereof. An excellent disputant or logician, arguing with great learning and discretion, and using much eloquence in his speech. A searcher into all kinds of mysteries and learning. He is sharp and witty, learning almost without any teacher. It's as if the sign of Gemini has this capacity to pick up things quickly. He's a mimic, he's an inventor. Isabel Pagan called him the sign of the inventor, or actually the sign of the inventor or the artist, which brings in the bringing down or the communication between worlds. We'll come into that in a moment. So he is sharp and witty, learning almost with anything without a teacher. Ambitious of being exquisite in every science. In other words, has a love of learning. He likes to travel and to link with people. A man of unwearied fancy, in other words, his mind is forever on the go, thinking about these things. He is curious in any search of occult knowledge, able by his own genius to produce wonders, given to divination and to the more secret knowledge. And if he be a merchant, no man exceeds him by way of trade or invention of new ways to obtain wealth. Now, I know that was a long description, but I find it a rather beautiful description from a 17th century text, that long ago we was able to describe this principle of Gemini as it comes into the personality in the form of a character. And this is how we recognize a Gemini, the one with the two mobiles. He's the one that goes up to the counter, and while talking to somebody, he's on the phone to somebody else, texting and looking at the price and paying for the food. That's a more negative side of the sign, who is busybodying all around, as William Lilly said, a kind of prattlet. What is actually going on, however, is, I must remind myself, is this constant need for knowledge in order to build up a better picture of life. This love of learning can go very deep. And it can go deep, in fact, that provided there are other elements, the sign of Gemini can even go into the underworld, like Hermes. He's called a psychopomp. He can go anywhere. This is almost like the value of words itself. Words are conveyors of information. They are channels of expression, either of the inner life or the outer life, of what's going on about us. This is through Gemini you get the creation, as I say, of systems of knowledge. Science, in many ways, is a defense against the unordered chaos of life. We give names to things. Gemini wants to know the names of things so it can get around. He's the map maker, the person that creates street names, and eventually it builds an entire picture, again, so he can orient and adapt himself around the environment. Now, why Pagan calls this the sign of the artist is, and you get many artists, and in fact many actors with the sign of Gemini. What comes to mind is Christopher Lee, interestingly enough, a horror movie actor. Peter Cushing, for that matter, also was a horror movie actor. It's as if this Gemini can kind of give a voice, a mimic to anything. Vincent Price was another horror actor, another Gemini. It's as if they have the capacity to take on things. And if you listen to Ian McKellen, particularly in the Tolkien trilogies and things like that, there's a sense of the immaculate articulation through the voice. And he manages to convey nuance through his deep study and deep connection to the principles of Shakespearean acting. So the importance of the sign of Gemini is to somehow find a way of communicating the inner with the outer, to create that exchange. That is the underlying cosmic principle inherent in the sign that all Geminis in their personality, one way or another, balanced or imbalanced, are destined to produce, are destined to express, and so therefore fulfill the nature inherent within the sign. Gemini is the sign of the brothers or the sisters, or that kind of relationship which is blood but also a difference. And this leads to a quality of friendliness, and many Geminis have many friends. Whether they're fair-weathered friends or deep friends really depends upon if they can get underneath, if they can stop skimming over the surface of mere contact in order to explore the substance of that contact and the values inherent in it. This frightens Gemini sometimes. It may take them quite a few years to start to explore the, or the air signs actually, to explore the dimensions of emotionality. It's not their forte, but words must be found to convey the truth of the inner convictions. So just like the signs of Cancer and Capricorn, Leo, and Aries often have problems with the parents. A lot of people have problems with the parents, but I mean intrinsically in the sign there's a pattern about the masculine or feminine deities within the sign which brings them into conflict in order for them to achieve something. Well, often in Gemini it's within the context of a sibling rivalry or a relationship of that kind. There's a sense here that in all of these signs, the mutable signs, the ones that link one season to another, there is an inherent duality, a difficulty with choice, a difficulty becoming and being themselves, partly because they're on the way somewhere. And that's an inherent quality of these, what they call mutable signs. So therefore, Gemini can, rather like Pisces often, unconsciously feel themselves becoming the opposite to what is in front of them. If a person is quiet, then they talk. If that person is talking, they become quiet. It's as if this opposing situation wants to mimic the other half in order to create that connection. One of the bad habits, I think, of Gemini is constantly talking with the idea that they're actually saying something. Now that may appear to be rude, but what I'm talking about is a sense of superficiality, of keeping something going, even though its value might have gone a long time ago. So this, as I say, busybodying, fussing about, needs to be really looked at or investigated. And one of the ways of doing that is for Gemini to occasionally stop their thinking process and to try and really take on board what another person is saying, because the mind is hardly ever in one place at one time. This busyness, as I say, is a kind of defense against chaos, against the unfathomable problems of emoting or getting too attached. And this can lead to a dissociative defense, where a person might write or become an artist. This is not necessarily a bad thing. How can one person spend so much time in one room? Doing something, involve them something with their own thought, if in some way they didn't have a dissociated interest, if you like. So, you know, the water signs need more involvement, I suppose. And although the air signs are known as the social signs, that word social is an involvement with a larger collective rather than the intimate involvement with another. Before we reach a conclusion with this sign, but I'd also like to just to briefly touch on the myth of the twins. More of this will be given in the text and the various references given in the text, so I won't do too much on this at this particular point. But the myth of the twins is important because there is a sense in all of these air signs that there is something beyond them which needs to be contacted. Whether it's inside or outside, it's always something. So the image I have is the joining of hands, the shaking of hands, that contact or meeting point that they're always trying to find. And somewhere in the sign, they feel lost because the sign of the twins is often, in mythology, one is born of heaven and one is born of the earth, or one is born overground and one is born on the underworld. This is also a bit like saying the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story. And sometimes the sign of Gemini can't be in one place at one time. So it's this idea that they can suddenly swap identities and that you don't really know who you're with sometimes. This can cause problems, but it can probably cause problems psychologically. But we should remember what we're talking about. The essence of these videos is to say that these are not actual problems. This is merely the ordering process, the underlying developmental process within the sign through which the sun will find itself as a unique individual. So in conclusion to this sign, trying to find a concluding statement, I think it would be this. People always have something interesting to say, provided that you open your eyes, open your heart, and open your mind, and listen intently and carefully.